Hello and welcome. This is Direct Talk. And I'm Ahmed Sagal hosting this show. On Friday, Tigrayan forces have surrendered their cruise-served weapons in presence of AU monitoring, verification, and compliance mechanism. The disarmament of Tigrayan forces was centered to the Pretoria Agreement alongside civilian protection, humanitarian delivery, resumption of services, as well as withdrawal of Eritrean forces and other non-India forces. And now, almost 7 months into the Pretoria Agreement, Eritrean forces and regional Amhara militias are still occupying some territories in Tigray. Humanitarian situations remain bleak. Significant amount of population are unsafe. To discuss the overall implementation of the Pretoria Agreement, I'm joined by Tsedale Lemma. She's a prominent journalist, a founder of Addis Standard and a political observer. Tsedale, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Abel. It's a pleasure to join you.
Okay, let's begin with the disarmament. What was your first take on the disarmament that took place yesterday and the demobilization process that was launched in the afternoon?
Well, that's part of the Pretoria cessation of hostilities, permanent cessation of hostilities agreement that was followed by the executive plan in Nairobi. So this is part of the Pretoria succeeded by a Nairobi agreement that the TPLF, the Tigray People Liberation Front, signed with the Ethiopian federal government. The timing is delayed. It was very ambitious to begin with, but Tigray is delivering despite the delays, and the delays cannot be blamed on the Tigrayan side only. But despite the delays, Tigray is complying with the agreement that is internationally brokered. And so that is part of it, and it shouldn't surprise us. And it's a good thing that the AU monitoring team is on the ground to verify, as it is mandated to do so. And so this now leaves the buck to stop at the Ethiopian federal government to reciprocate the disarmament as it is stipulated on the agreement, particularly the part that it says the disarmament of the heavy weaponry to happen concurrently with the withdrawal of foreign forces and non-ANF forces. That didn't happen. Tigray has handed over heavy weaponry a few weeks ago, and now they are moved into the second phase, which is the medium group artillery and weaponry. And that would, I think, will follow with individual disarmament according to the plan in the agreement. So that tells you that Tigray is, despite the delay in the scheduling, which, as I said earlier, was already was ambitious anyway, despite that, Tigray is meeting the commitment that it signed under the watch of the international community in a peace deal brokered by the African Union and the US and others. That is what I felt. The same is true with the demobilization of Tigrayan forces as well. I do believe that the National Demobilization Commission, led by the Ambassador Teshome Toga, is intensively working with the Tigrayan authorities, interim authorities, currently to implement the demobilization and reintegration of Tigrayan combatants. So we have seen the beginning of it yesterday, and it's a good thing that it is happening, that the young people are now looking forward to resume a normal life.
How about the presence of Eritrean forces? In April of this year, Tigray Television produced a segment that civilians in Eastern Tigray are under a risk of abduction in daily basis, as well as the AU monitoring team was obstructed and denied entry to the district of Iro by Eritrean forces. What can you say about the Eritrean forces? Where could the presence of Eritrean forces take this agreement?
Look, as I said, the buck stops at the Prime Minister's desk currently. According to we all know, the world knows what Eritrean forces did in Eritrea, with a genocidal, in Tigray with a genocidal war. They are accused of verified reports on ethnic crimes against humanity and war crimes. And we've been documenting their crimes that they were doing in Tigray. Now, the Ethiopian government has signed an agreement, an internationally brokered agreement, in which it has committed to safeguard the territorial integrity of the Ethiopian state. That didn't happen. It was supposed to happen concurrently with the disarmament of heavy weaponry of the Tigrayan forces. We missed that mark. The federal government hasn't said anything so far about the presence of Eritrean forces on the sovereign territory of the Ethiopian state. You can forget Tigray for the time being. Although they are occupying Tigrayan lands, in the grand scheme of things, they are occupying a sovereign territory of the Ethiopian state. This primarily has to be the responsibility of the federal government and the federal forces to ensure the withdrawal of foreign forces, and also, according to the agreement that they have signed, ensure the respect for the constitutional order. So far, the federal government has failed to do so. And Eritrean forces continue to do what they have been doing for the last 2 years, displacing, raping, killing, abducting, all sorts of war crimes and crimes against humanity that they have been accused of, with enough evidence around. So this has to come to now the federal government again. It's not a matter of the Tigrayan forces to fight for that. It is a matter of the Ethiopian state and the federal government that is leading the Ethiopian state to ensure the sovereign territory and integrity of the Ethiopian state. And so it has to be, I believe that the Tigrayan interim administration is lobbying for that to happen. And the Ethiopian federal government must do that in the interest of its own credibility, because what they have signed is not a local agreement. This is an internationally brokered agreement, and breach to that will have an international consequence in its credibility and in its attempt to normalize relations with multinationals and the West and its partners in the rest of the world. So for this sake, and for the sake of also presiding over a territorially respected state, the federal government must take this upon itself and ensure the withdrawal of Eritrean forces, and also ensure the respect to the constitutional order as they have signed by withdrawing Amhara forces from the western and parts of southern Tigray, and respecting the federal constitution, because that is what they have signed. And this is what I believe must happen now.
What can be the role of the international community and the observers to the Pretoria Agreement in this regard?
They have a role because, if you remember, Uhuru Kenyatta said when they have signed the executive plan of the implementation of the Pretoria Agreement in Nairobi, he has said anyone who has failed to comply with this will face a serious consequence. So it's about time that the brokers, the international brokers, most importantly the African Union, because this is its record. This is what they have been able to deliver. And it's in their interest to make sure that it is respected according to the agreement that they have brokered. And so the international community who have interest in the stability of Ethiopia, and the African Union, which is sitting in the backyard in Addis there, must take it upon itself that it has delivered a complete and successful peace process. So they must push for Eritrean government to withdraw its mercenaries from the Tigrayan lands and ensure that the Ethiopian government is presiding over a territorially respected state. And this will have implications by far. So it should be in their interest as well to make sure that this peace process is complied by both parties. It's a record on the African Union, and they have to really shoulder the responsibility to make sure it happened.
Okay, let's proceed to a statement issued by TPLF on the 16th of May, which says that the decision by the National Election Board of Ethiopia is very dangerous, and that it might danger the peace process in general. What can you say about the decision by the National Board of Election?
Well, the Ethiopian National Election Board, the Election Board, ENB, I guess, has made that surprising decision, of course. We understood the timing when it took the first decision in, I think, January of 2021, in canceling the registration of TPLF as a political party. They have cited the law, the electoral law, that doesn't allow armed groups that are engaged in armed violence against the federal government to remain a viable political party. So there is a clause in the electoral law that allows the board to cancel the registration of the TPLF. But it is something that has a glitch in the electoral law, in a sense that if there is an exit strategy or an exit clause in the electoral board to cancel political parties, it falls short of re-entry into the political space of political parties that have renounced armed struggle. This is one point. It shows the shortfall of the electoral board, which should have been taken seriously, but to discuss and amend, if possible, the electoral law itself, or add a regulation that would allow the TPLF to remain a political party for two reasons. Number one, the National Parliament has delisted the TPLF from the terrorist designation, which I believe throughout the time was illegal in the first place. When they designated the TPLF, Tigray people did not have representatives in the National Parliament. However, they have delisted the TPLF. So these are the national lawmakers. This is the upper, if you look into the structure, the governing structure in the country. So they have delisted the TPLF. That means that the government has a partner to deal with, number one. Number two, the TPLF is a signatory to the Pretoria Agreement and the following agreement of the executive plan in Nairobi. That's an internationally brokered agreement. That means that TPLF is a party to that agreement. So I don't think that the election board considered the implication of cancelling and asking the TPLF to re-register again on the international order or this agreement that the Ethiopian government signed with. It will leave the Ethiopian government without a partner in this internationally brokered peace process. So there has to be a compromise and a means to come forward other than going straight to the nuclear option of cancelling the TPLF. So the election board should have thought about its implications. It will indirectly render the federal government a rogue state because it will leave it without a partner into the signatory of the Pretoria Agreement. So they should have really considered that. To that end, I think the TPLF's response to it is justified. And I do believe that the African Union, I think they have also submitted a letter to the African Union, will take it up on itself that its brokered agreement will not be left without a partner, without one part of the partner or the signatory to implement the peace process and to avoid any other legal glitches and make the electoral board to find a way to revert this decision. I hope that they will reach into that kind of decision at the end.
Okay, how about the issue of humanitarian delivery? The humanitarian delivery was one terms to the Pretoria Agreement, but the humanitarian situation in Tigray remains bleak as we speak, and there is also a suspension of aid by the UN agencies to Tigray. What can you say about it?
It's an absolute tragedy, Abel, if you ask me. Humanitarian aid delivery or theft on humanitarian aid is as old as the humanitarian industry itself. So to say, Tigray is not the exception. It is, in many cases, the norm. What happened in Tigray? Yes, I believe that it has to be investigated. I believe that the interim administration led by Getachew Reda, as they have publicly promised to thoroughly investigate the practice of aid theft, they are doing such. But this is not an exception. Humanitarian aid theft happens in Yemen, it's happening in Sudan today. And so going for this kind of screeching halt of humanitarian aid delivery to a community that was under a complete siege is really not justified. I am not saying this to justify the practice of diverting humanitarian aid should go unchecked. I'm far from it. And there has to be an understanding that the war on Tigray primarily targeted in collapsing its political infrastructure, its leadership, and anything that resembles a political order in the Tigray region. So there has been a collapse of that for the last 2 years because of the war. And the humanitarian agencies should have considered this into account, that there is a collapse of a system there, a system that was built over decades. And their decision should have considered that glitches could happen like this. Humanitarian aid diversion could be an outcome of that, and also an outcome of the bad apple. You know, I'm not excusing people who have been engaged in diverting humanitarian aid to the vulnerable people. But that doesn't really justify a screeching halt in the delivery of humanitarian aid, because the Tigrayan people have been through a complete siege for 2 years. And famine has been sipping through every household of the peasantry and the working class, and also the haves and the have-nots in the regional states. So it should have considered all these fragile circumstances before they really reach out this kind of dramatic decision to stop aid. After all, the humanitarian organizations have tolerated the federal government when it deliberately put the region under siege. And they have found a way somewhat a way to continue delivering, regardless of the amount, some level of humanitarian aid to the Tigray region. And if they found a way to deal with a regime that has completely blocked an entire region for 2 years, I'm sure they could find a way to address aid diversion issues and continue reaching out to the vulnerable. So this is really not a justifiable decision, but I do hope that it will resume very soon, sooner than it already is delayed so far.
Speaking of the suspension of aid, on Tuesday, major Tigrayan cities witnessed one of the biggest rallies in their history. That was a demonstration by the IDPs opposing the suspension of aid, and they also demand the return to home and to farm. They say they want to learn and go back home. They also asked the withdrawal of Eritrean forces and Amhara forces. How did you see the demonstrations across Tigray?
Well, I saw a people that still believes that contractors are honored, because the demands that the people of Tigray raised in that demonstration in multiple cities and towns and throughout the region is a call for respect for the peace agreement. Returning the IDPs is part of the peace agreement. Withdrawal of Eritrean forces is part of the peace agreement. Facilitating unhindered delivery of aid is part of the peace agreement. So what the Tigrayan people ask is a respect for that peace agreement that the federal government signed under the watch of the international community with the TPLF. So this is, they're not demanding anything that's extraordinary to be done for them, especially, or they're not demanding any kind of privilege over any other parts of the country. The people in the country, they are demanding respect for that order, because this is inherently the nature of the people of Tigray, that there is that kind of trust. When you have signed something, you're expected to deliver it. So I believe that the federal government, or I hope the federal government listens to that, heeds to that call for its own sake, and return the millions of IDPs that are brutally and through the practice of ethnic cleansing displaced from their homelands, and withdraw the Eritrean forces that continued committing crimes as we speak, and also restore constitutionalism for its own sake, not just for humanitarian or for sake of sympathy of the Tigrayan people. This has to be a two-way street, respecting the Pretoria Agreement and the executive plan signed in Nairobi afterwards is and should be in the interest of the federal government. As I keep saying, it's about its own credibility and reliability in the eyes of the international community and its partners, multinationals and countries that are cooperating with the Ethiopian government. Currently, there is no. You've probably heard that the Minister of Finance, Ahmed Shide, was telling the National Parliament that there have not been any budgetary support to the federal government since the last 9 months. Actually, it dates back since the war broke out. It should be in the interest of the federal government to respect an agreement that they have signed, because if you have noticed, what the international community have been asking is respect for the territorial integrity of the Ethiopian state. And if a government is not presiding over a territorial integrity and respecting the very constitution that they have used as a benchmark to sign an internationally brokered agreement, then the credibility of that very government is under question, and they will have it very tough to restore their relations with the international community. So it's not for the sake of the Tigrayan people only, it's also for the sake of the credibility and acceptance of the federal government in the eyes of the international community, that they respect the Pretoria Agreement. So the people of Tigray are asking the federal government to just do that. That's what I see in that demonstration.
Finally, what do you think is left from both parties for the agreement to be fully complied, and from the international community and observers to the agreement?
Well, as I said, Abel, Tigray is delivering, and the next phase is going to be the political dialogue that will target to address the differences that led to the 2 years genocidal war on Tigray. That is part of it. But what I also see is a lack of commitment, I believe, from both sides to address the issue of accountability. It has to happen. It has to. Both parties must show their commitment to seriously address the issue of, because crimes have been committed, crimes, unprecedented crimes that, in my understanding, could amount to genocide. However, the crimes that are committed are labeled already as crimes against humanity and war crimes. This is just a flip side of genocide, and that cannot be ignored. And Tigrayan authorities must really push the international community for the UN mandated international experts on human rights to set foot on areas that crimes have been committed, be it in Tigray, in Afar, and Amhara regional states. And a thorough investigation of what exactly took place must take place as soon as possible, so that the issue of accountability can be taken seriously. I don't see that happening, and this is a bit disappointing. And I don't really also expect people who are a part of those crimes to prosecute themselves. So the international community should really push for an independent investigation of what took place, so that accountability issues can start as soon as possible. And this should be in the interest of both the federal government and the Tigrayan authorities. So what is left now is for the federal government to fully comply with the agreement that is signed. They lag behind on that end, and for both parties to kick in the political conversations and dialogue to address the serious differences that led to the war, because that has not been addressed so far, and for the issue of accountability to take center stage in the process so far. This is what I see is lacking from the agreement so far.
Tsedale, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Abel. Have a good day.